I've never been so embarrassed in my life. I was just trying to enjoy a simple meal, and then the waiter said, "You don't belong here." The words hit me like a slap across the face. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth as the entire restaurant seemed to pause and stare at me. How did I get to this point? How did my dinner turn into a moment of pure humiliation? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Set the stage. I'm Jenna, 25 years old, and like most people, I just wanted a quiet dinner out with my friends. It wasn't anything special. Sarah and Mia were with me, and we'd been to this trendy restaurant before. It was always busy, always packed with people, but the food was great. Nothing fancy, nothing weird. But this time, something was off. The waiter, Mark, had been a little distant when we sat down. At first, I thought maybe it was just because the place was so crowded, and maybe he was stressed. But then it started feeling like more than that. He didn't make eye contact, barely said anything, and his tone was clipped whenever he spoke to me. I brushed it off, figuring he was just having a bad night. But when he came to take our order, I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something in his eyes, a mix of disdain and annoyance that seemed directed straight at me. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was hard to ignore when he kept making little comments under his breath that were clearly aimed at me. Tease the mystery. So I thought, maybe I'm just overthinking this. But then, when it was time for the check, everything exploded. And he looked me right in the eyes and said, "You don't belong here." It was like the world stopped. My friends went silent, looking between me and Mark, but no one said anything. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I noticed something. The owner of the restaurant was standing at the bar, watching us closely. Had he heard everything? Why wasn't he doing anything? What happened next was something I never saw coming. The owner, Mr. Thompson, walked over. He didn't say a word to Mark, but I could tell the tension was building. Everyone in the restaurant watched us. And then, Mr. Thompson spoke. "Pack your things." The words felt like a punch in the gut. But why did Mark look so unfazed? What was going to happen next? Would I just leave, or would something else happen? I stared at Mark. I'm trying to make sense of what was happening. The words still rang in my ears. "You don't belong here." Was he serious? Was this some kind of sick joke? I could feel my heart pounding in my chest and my hands were shaking. The room felt colder. I looked around. People were starting to whisper, turning their heads to glance at me and my table. It wasn't just the tension in the air, it was the realization that I was the center of attention, and not in a good way. What did he mean by that? What did he have against me? For context, I wasn't someone who usually stood out. I wasn't dressed outrageously or acting in a way that should have drawn attention. I was just a girl trying to enjoy a night out with friends. I didn't understand why Mark, a guy who I'd seen serve tables before, was acting like this. It wasn't just the comment either, and it was the way he'd been treating me all night. When I asked for a recommendation on a dish, he barely glanced at me as if I wasn't worth his time. When I asked for water, he rolled his eyes before pouring it like I was bothering him. Each little moment chipped away at my confidence, but I told myself, it's fine. He's probably having a rough day. But now it was like the tipping point. His words felt personal, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Sarah and Mia noticed the shift too. Sarah was usually the first to call out bad behavior, but even she was silent, unsure of what to do. Mia, on the other hand, tried to diffuse the tension by changing the subject, but I could tell it wasn't helping. The more Mark ignored us and made snide comments, the more uncomfortable we all became. It was like he was trying to make us feel unwelcome. And I didn't get why. It wasn't just me either. I could see that people around us were starting to notice how Mark was acting. Some of them looked uncomfortable, like they could tell something wasn't right but didn't know how to intervene. Others were staring directly at us, waiting for some sort of conflict to erupt. There was one moment that really stood out to me. Mark was standing at the counter, staring at the ticket orders, but his eyes kept darting toward our table. He didn't look angry, but there was a strange bitterness in his gaze. I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but then he walked back to our table and made another snide remark. "I hope you're enjoying your meal," he said with a smirk. "Not that you'll be coming back anytime soon." I froze. What the heck was that supposed to mean? And that was the moment I couldn't take it anymore. But before I could say anything, I noticed something. The owner, Mr. Thompson, was standing by the bar, watching us intently. His gaze was fixed on our table. Was he seeing everything that was happening? And why wasn't he stepping in? I had a feeling the situation was about to escalate, but I couldn't tell how far it would go. Suddenly, Mark stopped in his tracks. He looked toward Mr. Thompson and his face paled. Something changed in the air. What was Mr. Thompson going to do? Was he going to step in or just let this continue? The silence in the restaurant grew thicker, and I could feel my heart rate increase. Mark had frozen when he saw Mr. Thompson watching him. It was like time itself had paused. I was standing at the edge of something, unsure of what was going to happen next. Then, Mr. Thompson took a few steps forward, and my stomach dropped. I could see Mark's jaw clench as he turned back toward us, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. And that's when things took a turn for the worse. Mark's voice broke through the tension like a crack of thunder. "What, you think you can just get away with acting like you own the place?" he sneered, looking straight at me. I was stunned. His words cut deeper than I could have imagined. I wasn't just some random customer to him. I was the target of his anger, and for reasons I couldn't fathom. I'd never been this humiliated in my life. Before I could speak, Sarah jumped in, her voice shaky. "Excuse me, that's completely out of line," she said, trying to intervene, but Mark wasn't hearing it. "You can't just sit there and act like you belong in a place like this," Mark continued, and his voice rising. I could feel the weight of his words, the judgment in them. The other diners were starting to look directly at our table, and I could hear murmurs spreading like wildfire. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to shout at him that I didn't deserve this treatment, but the words felt stuck in my throat. How had it come to this? Then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, Mr. Thompson spoke up, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "That's enough, Mark." Mark looked up at him, clearly confused. "What are you going to do about it?" he said, his voice dripping with defiance. But what happened next completely caught me off guard. Mr. Thompson didn't raise his voice, but his words were firm and final. "You're fired." The shock hit me like a wave. Our Mark's face twisted into something almost unrecognizable, part anger, part disbelief. For a second, he just stood there, frozen. And in that moment, everything shifted. The entire restaurant fell into an eerie silence. No one moved. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Mark didn't react immediately. His face turned red as he stood there, staring at Mr. Thompson like he didn't believe what was happening. A few seconds passed before he scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You can't be serious," he muttered. "You really think firing me will fix anything?" Mr. Thompson didn't flinch. "I'm serious. Pack your things, now." As the tension in the restaurant reached its peak, the patrons continued to watch in stunned silence. What would happen next? Would Mark lash out? Or would he leave quietly? The restaurant was completely still. You could feel the collective breath of everyone in the room being held. Mark stood there for what seemed like an eternity, his fists clenched at his sides. His face was a mixture of fury and disbelief, as if he couldn't process what was happening. The whole restaurant was waiting for his next move. Was he going to storm out, or was he going to make this even worse? Mark's eyes flickered between Mr. Thompson and the stunned patrons. For a moment, I thought he might try to argue, maybe even shout at Mr. Thompson. But instead, he just laughed, an empty, bitter sound that filled the silence. "You think this is going to solve everything?" he spat. But Mr. Thompson didn't blink. He crossed his arms and stood tall, watching Mark with an unwavering calm. "You've been warned before, Mark. You've crossed a line this time. There's no going back." Mark's face turned red, and I could see his frustration boiling over. He slammed his hand against the counter, glaring at the staff around him. "Fine," he muttered through clenched teeth. "I'm done here. This place is nothing anyway." With that, he turned and stormed toward the back door of the restaurant, his footsteps heavy and loud against the quiet. Every eye in the place was on him as he walked out. The tension didn't immediately leave the room, but slowly, things started to settle back down. Once Mark disappeared behind the kitchen doors, Mr. Thompson turned to me, his face softening. "I'm so sorry you had to experience that," he said sincerely. "That kind of behavior is not acceptable here. where we don't tolerate discrimination or mistreatment of any kind. I could barely process what had just happened. The humiliation, the shock, the entire bizarre experience. It was all a whirlwind. But hearing Mr. Thompson apologize felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't just about Mark being fired, it was about someone standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. But there was still something bothering me. What had led Mark to act like that in the first place? And why had he singled me out? Before I could ask any questions, one of the other waiters, Carla, walked over quietly. Hey, I just wanted to say I'm really sorry about what happened. You're not the first person Mark has treated like this. He's had issues with certain people, especially those he didn't think fit in. The words hit me hard. Didn't fit in? What was that supposed to mean? Why had Mark targeted me? I felt my stomach twist as I realized there was more to this story than I could have imagined. What exactly was going on with Mark? And what had he meant by that comment? The next few days felt like a blur. I kept replaying everything in my head. Mark's comments, the shock of the firing, the tension in the air. But as time passed, the pieces started to fall into place. Carla, the other waiter, had dropped a hint that stuck with me. Mark had a history of treating certain people badly, people he didn't think belonged in the type of clientele the restaurant wanted to attract. It turns out Mark had a prejudice against people he considered out of place, people who didn't fit his narrow idea of what patrons should look like or act like. The more I heard, the more I understood. His treatment of me wasn't just about a bad day or a mistake. It was deliberate. He had a problem with the diversity of the customers, and I just happened to be one of the targets that night. That's why he'd treated me so differently. It wasn't me. It was him. Mr. Thompson explained that this wasn't the first time Mark had been reprimanded for inappropriate behavior toward customers. The restaurant had received complaints before, but they'd always given him another chance. This time, however, he crossed a line, and the owner wasn't willing to let it slide anymore. Firing him wasn't just about what happened with me. It was the culmination of repeated issues that no longer could be ignored. I was flooded with relief, but also with anger. How could someone act like that? It was hard to understand, and even harder to accept that I had been the target of his anger simply because I didn't fit his idea of who belonged. But even though the whole experience was traumatic, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. Mr. Thompson had stood up for what was right, and even though I'd been humiliated in front of everyone, in the end, the right thing had been done. I felt a strong emotional release as I realized that I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't out of place. Mark was the one who was out of line, and it was about time someone held him accountable. The feeling of validation hit me hard. I wasn't the problem. He was. The impact of Mark's firing was felt throughout the restaurant. Word quickly spread among the staff, and most of them felt a sense of relief. No one had liked working with Mark. He'd been rude to everyone. Not just customers, but no one had dared to speak up until now. His firing made people realize that Mr. Thompson wasn't just the owner of the restaurant. He was a man of principle who wasn't afraid to do what was right, even if it was uncomfortable. As for Mark, his reputation took a huge hit. It wasn't just about losing his job at one restaurant, it was the fact that his actions had now been made public. He had a hard time finding work after that. The word about his behavior spread fast, and he became known for his toxic attitude, making it nearly impossible to get hired again. The consequences of his actions were far-reaching, and they followed him long after he left that night. As for me, I left that restaurant with a feeling of closure, even if the night had been full of discomfort and humiliation. I didn't let the experience define me. In fact, it empowered me. I knew that no matter what anyone else thought, I was worthy of respect. That night was a turning point in my life. I learned to stand up for myself when someone tried to tear me down, and I learned that doing the right thing doesn't always mean being the loudest voice. It means having the courage to act when it matters. And when I walked out of that restaurant, I walked out a little stronger, a little wiser, and a lot more confident in who I am. I wasn't out of place. I was exactly where I needed to be.